Thank you. I have to say, I'm already so excited by being here. I've been checking out the website and reading a little bit about what FutureChurch does. And I just can't tell you how encouraging this is. And in fact, I said before I got here, I said to Deborah that I think I'm preaching to the choir with this, but that's okay because we're all in this together. And I have to say, while Women in English Sermons is coming, my next book is going to be something else that I think y'all are really going to like. So let me just say, we'll be announcing it soon, but I think y'all are really going to like it. So I'm going to start, and I'm doing something. I have some pictures for you. And there's so many different angles I could have talked about for this talk, but I decided to focus on Martha. And so that is going to be, and I hope that we can have some rich conversation afterwards, and it already sounds like we will. So we'll do that, and I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all have, whether or not they relate to the talk. So I'll go ahead and try to share my screen to give y'all some pictures to look at while I talk. And hopefully this will be successful. There you are. Will somebody tell me if it's okay? I see Deborah shaking her head. Great. Okay, good.
Oh, good.
Then I'll go ahead and begin. And my title of my talk is Erasing Women's Biblical Leadership. So I start off with my classroom. Dr. Barr, I'm confused about which Martha you are discussing. Is this the one in the Bible? It was my European women's history class, and we were comparing biblical women with how they were perceived by the medieval church, which is a really fun thing to do with undergraduate students. We talked about Phoebe, who is the only named deacon in the New Testament, which I am sure you all know. And this is a medieval image here that you can see on the right. This is one of the only medieval images that we actually have that shows Phoebe, and it's an extraordinary image because you can see Paul is giving her directly the letter to the Romans. It's a very authoritative picture, so it's really fantastic. So we talk about Phoebe, the only named deacon in the New Testament. While she doesn't appear often in medieval texts, she was recognized as authoritative by Abelard and used to buttress the authority of abbacis. We also talk about Mary Magdalene, who you can see right here. And this is an image from the Cathedral of Notre Dame that I took a few years ago. And we talk about, as Mary Magdalene, as you all know, who was conflated with Mary of Bethany as early as the 7th century and gained the reputation of the apostle to the apostles. And this is the image that we see here for bringing the good news of the resurrection. And then we talk about Martha. Just to help you understand my students' confusion, although I suspect y'all are much more familiar with this version of Martha than my students. This is the story that we discuss. And I want you to know I'm actually reading from my class notes. And I also want to know, although I suspect some of you know this, the version of the Martha story I'm telling here is from the Golden Legend, which was an insanely popular medieval text. It was composed in the 13th century, and more than 1,000 copies of it survive today, which tell us it really was a medieval bestseller. Okay, so this is from my class notes, the version that I draw from the Golden Legend. This is what it says. It says, Martha was one of the earliest followers of Jesus, designated as a ministry leader in Luke 10, 38 through 42. She was one of the first to believe that Jesus truly was the Messiah who had come to save the world. Indeed, when asked point blank who she thought Jesus was, she responded, I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming to the world, John 11. After the resurrection and ascension, chances are she was alongside the earliest followers of Jesus, praying together in the upper room that we read about in the first of Acts. She certainly, and this is where we get to the Golden Legend, she certainly heeded the words of Jesus to go out from Jerusalem and make disciples of all the world. She sailed across the Mediterranean to the shores of a land we know today as France. And I'll go to my next pictures here. She began to preach the gospel of Jesus to all the people there. Hundreds converted to Christianity. One day, Martha wandered into the woods and went down to the river. There on the shores, she encountered the gruesome sight of a dragon eating a man. And I have some of my favorite medieval renderings of this story. I particularly like this one where his legs are hanging out of her mouth. I think that one's really great. According to the text, it was a half beast and half fish, greater than an ox, longer than a horse, having teeth sharp as a sword and horned on either side, head like a lion, tail like a serpent, with 2 wings on either side. It could not be beaten with stones or other weapons and was as strong as 12 lions or bears. But Martha was unafraid. She sprinkled holy water on the beast, which she happened to have tucked in a wand in her cloak, and then paralyzed it by showing it the image of the cross. It was easy after that. She calmly tied up the dragon with her girdle and waited for the local townspeople to come and stab it to death with their spears. Martha continued working alongside her sister after this, preaching and performing miracles and spreading the good news of Jesus. Now, it's at this point that my student asked me that question, Dr. Barr, are you sure this is the same Martha? Now, I don't remember exactly what my students talked about after that point, but I do remember their surprise. While they had heard of Phoebe as a deacon and Mary Magdalene as a preacher, although many of my Protestant evangelical students would not have agreed with those designations, they at least had heard of them. They had never heard Martha labeled as a ministry leader. To them, Martha was something very different. Martha was, as I like to call her, the hostess with the mostess. She was the irritated hostess who got mad at her sister for wasting time sitting with Jesus instead of helping with the household chores. And one of my favorite images here is this one that I took from a kid's Sunday school text. So, you just really gets the picture of the irritated hostess here with Martha. Indeed, John Piper, if y'all know who he is, I don't really want to talk that much about John Piper, but he tweeted in 2016 sort of the usual modern evangelical narrative of Martha of Bethany. This is what he tweeted. He said, Martha is preparing a feast for Jesus. Mary is feasting on the words of Jesus. And this is a very clear contrast that we see that Mary is listening to Jesus while Martha is getting distracted by the housework or the tasks of women. This is exactly what I talk about in my book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. I recount how popular writers like Katie M. Reed and Sarah May describe Martha as a homemaker. Sarah May wrote her 2016 book on housekeeping around the story of Mary and Martha, titling it, Having a Martha Home the Mary Way, 31 Days to a Clean House with a Satisfied Soul. Now, I have to tell you that I've actually talked with Sarah May since then, and it's interesting. She's fine with me having talked about her book in this way. So I also recently looked up images of Martha on evangelical websites, and what I found is what you see here. Almost every image renders her as taking care of household chores. From this perspective, it is not surprising that for my students, Martha as a ministry leader, much less as a preacher, is as fantastical as the dragon she kills. Yet, I think the opposite is actually true. I think Martha as an irritated hostess is much less in line with the biblical text than Martha as a preaching evangelist. I think the problem is not with the text. I think the problem is with how we have erased women from the text. So let's look a little bit more closely at the story here, and we'll talk about what happened to it. So here's the text from Luke 10, 38 through 42. Now as they, and I'm quoting this from the NRSV. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying. But Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her to help me. But the Lord answered her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by so many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. My Protestant evangelical context assumes that because Martha welcomed Jesus into her home, this means that the many tasks that distracted her were domestic. And so this is how we portray her. But y'all, is this actually what the text says? Warren Carter wrote a Fascinating article in 1996. And for those of you who are unaware of it, I put it here so that you can look it up for yourself. At the time, he was a professor of New Testament at St. Paul's School of Theology and a recent graduate with his PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. He since went on to become an acclaimed New Testament professor at Bright Divinity School at Texas Christian University, which is not very far from where I am, and now is the LaDonna Kramer Minders Professor of New Testament at Phillips Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The article is titled, Getting Martha Out of the Kitchen. I really love that title. And it's in the Catholic Biblical Quarterly from April 1996. Listen to what he says. He says, quote, while conventional analysis sees Martha as the harried hostess, performing her kitchen duties without help from Mary, several indicators in the context and in the presentation of the scene indicate this is an unlikely reading. So why does he say that? Well, first he says, that Martha as the harried hostess is not taking into an account the context of the story. So let's look at the whole passage. Did you know that this scene with Mary and Martha that starts in Luke 10, verse 38, follows the mission of the 70, which is Luke 10, 1 through 20? As Warren Carter reminds us, Jesus tells his followers to enter a town and find someone to receive them. Being received, writes Carter, involves much more than being supplied with food and drink. It primarily denotes the embracing of the disciples' missions and its eschatological reality. This positive description of how Jesus's followers should be received as they go out on mission is immediately followed by his positive reception of Martha, not as a domestic caretaker, but as a disciple and a master of her household. As Carter writes, Martha's receiving Jesus signifies her commitment to Jesus's mission and to the God who sent him. She appears as a model disciple, which definitely changes our perspective a little. Let's look at Warren Carter's second point. And I know this is something that y'all are familiar with because I've been reading through your website. But he also points out that the word used to describe Martha's domestic tasks doesn't actually mean domestic tasks. And it is the word diakonia, okay? And as I said, this is a word we're all familiar with. It is an action word for a messenger. And if you think back to that first picture that we saw, that medieval picture of Phoebe, I really like that picture because it shows the action of her description as a deacon. We see Paul giving her the word of God and her standing, receiving it to go and deliver it to the disciples behind her. So we see the action involved in her role of deacon. So it's an action word for a messenger, a go-between, an officiator, a mediator, a minister, someone attending on the needs of others, which can include meal service, but it's not limited to that. The word does not designate subservient status, as is often applied to those in leadership positions. Indeed, the primary New Testament usage of the word diakonia is ministry. It's the word from which we get deacon. So let's just look at some of the scripture here. I'm sure y'all are familiar with a lot of it, but it's kind of nice to put it all together. And so here are all the times in the books of Luke and Acts that we find the word diakonia listed, okay? First of all, we find it in the use and the selection of a new disciple. We find it in Acts 1:17. For Judas was numbered among us and was allotted his share in the ministry, the diakonia. In Acts 1:25, show us which one of these two you have chosen to take the place in this ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside. We also find it in the choosing of the 7, the deacons, to serve. Acts 6:1, the disciples were increasing in number, the widows were being neglected in daily ministrations, diakonia. Acts 6:4, but we will devote ourselves to prayer and to serving, diakonia, the word. We also find it used in the ministry of disciples and apostles. Acts 11:29, then the disciples sent relief, diakonia, ministry, to the believers living in Judea. We find it in Acts 12:25. Then after completing their diaconia, Barnabas and Saul returned to Jerusalem and brought with them John, whose name was also Mark. And we find it in the use of Paul's ministry. Acts 20:24, but I do not count my life of any value to myself, if only I may finish my course and the diaconia that I received from the Lord Jesus to testify the good news of God's grace. And Acts 21:19, after greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his diaconia ministry. And then we get to Martha. Luke 10:40. But Martha was distracted by her diaconia, many tasks. So she came to him and asked, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work, which directly corresponds with diaconia, for myself? Tell her to help me. Think about that. When you heard the word ministry, mission, service with the male disciples, did you see them preaching, making decisions as leaders, teaching others, spreading the gospel? If so, you're correct. Diaconia indicates ministry, preaching, teaching, evangelizing, caring for others, etc. As Warren Carter writes, rather than designating a person of inferior status involved in waiting or domestic service, the word tasks, serving, typically designates a commissioned spokesperson or agent, a go-between, who ministers on behalf of God or the Christian community. And when I get to the end of this, I'm going to have to go back to that original picture of Phoebe, that medieval vision of her, because it so encapsulates this idea of diaconia. Yet when you heard Martha's many tasks and the work Mary left to her, did you envision a person involved in domestic service? Y'all, this connotation is not in the text. We have brought it to the text. The word diaconia for Martha's tasks is the same word applied to the ministry of Barnabas and Saul. In other words, Martha's tasks probably aren't cooking dinner, or at least not limited to presenting dinner. Martha's tasks are ministry. While my Protestant evangelical situation makes me think that Martha probably wasn't a dragon slayer, I am just as convinced that Martha wasn't a domestic hostess either. If we look at Martha's work from the perspective of Barnabas and Saul, the medieval version of her story as a preaching evangelist looks more accurate than that of the harried hostess. The reason that we don't realize Martha's leadership is not because it isn't there, and I just used the double negative there. The reason we don't realize Martha's leadership is because we have written it out of the text. I want to give you one more example of this, a very clear example of this. In fact, I would argue it's the clearest example of how we have written women's leadership out of the Bible. It's from Romans 16:7. From Romans 16. And in that passage in Romans 16, I won't read all of it here. It has a remarkable number of women listed by their ministry, including this woman. Greet Andronicus and Junia, my relatives who were in prison with me. They are prominent among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was. Now, for those of you who've read my book and know something about me, you know I often pick on the English Standard Version of the Bible, the ESV. And so tonight won't be an exception. It is just it's such a clear example of how we have carried patriarchy to the gospel of Christ. And so if you look in the ESV and you read Romans 16:7 is Phoebe, you will see a note next to Junia's name. This is what it reads in the ESV. It reads, or Junius. You will also note that rather than described as outstanding among the apostles, Andronicus and Junia are described as well known to the apostles. Why does it do this? While the English Standard Version was created specifically to combat the dangerous influence of feminism growing in the church, most of the translators of the ESV subscribe to complementarian teachings. And I can say that because I have gone through every single name on that list. And they actually describe themselves as unapologetically complementarian. They weren't the only translation committee, however, to find Junia's leadership problematic. New Testament scholar Eldon J. Epp compiled 2 tables surveying Greek New Testaments from Erasmus through the 20th century. Together, the charts show that the Greek name Junia was almost universally translated in its female form until the 20th century, when the name suddenly began to be translated as the masculine Junius. Junius then became the translation used in several English Bibles, including the 1978 and 1984 NIV, the 1970 NEB, the 1970 Roman Catholic New American Bible, the American Standard Version of 1901, the 1952 and 1971 Revised Standard Version, and even the 1995 New American Standard Bible. All of those texts, Junia, as a female apostle, was changed to a man. Why? Theologian Beverly Roberts Gaventa tells us why. She says, Epp makes it painfully, maddeningly clear that a major factor in the treatment of Junia is the assumption that a woman could not have been an apostle. Junia became Junius because modern Christians assumed that only a man could be an apostle. Biblical womanhood was read into the text instead of the text being used to understand women's roles. And by biblical womanhood, I mean this idea that women are called by God to serve under male leadership and not to lead themselves. Junia couldn't be a woman because modern evangelical culture argued that women couldn't be spiritual leaders. Yet scholarship overwhelmingly demonstrates that Junia is the correct name and that it is a woman's name, that most of these translations had to back down. They had to admit that Junia is female. So a different tactic had to be taken by those who could not accept Junia as a female apostle. The ESV shows us this. Remember that second part of what it did? It had the note that Junia could be translated Junius, which actually is not correct at all. But then instead of recording her as outstanding among the apostles, it changed her to well-known to the apostles. They had to concede she was a woman, but they still refused to recognize her as a church leader. I am absolutely certain that if Junia had originally been a masculine name, no one would have questioned the attribution outstanding among the apostles. The only reason it became a question is because she's a woman. Instead of letting the biblical text inform their interpretations, translators have let their interpretations inform the biblical text. Junia had to be explained away because of the evangelical beliefs that women should not lead. She appears as a male apostle, not because she was one, but because we changed her name to fit our assumptions about women. I think what has happened to Junia is also what has happened to Martha. Martha looks like a domestic hostess, not because she is one, but because we have made her one. And this is even more egregious because we have obscured her true role as a woman in ministry so much that my modern evangelical classroom does not even recognize that she could have been a preacher and teacher. Women's leadership only appears to be absent from the Bible because of how we have changed the meaning of the text. Or, as I put it in The Making of Biblical Womanhood, the problem isn't a lack of women leading in both the Bible and in church history. The problem is that we have forgotten it. So I'll stop there so that we have time for questions, which I think is always one of the most valuable parts of this. And I had a brain freeze in there. It is Romans, it came back to me. Romans 16:7 is Junia. Sorry, I didn't have that in my notes and I had a brain freeze, but that's accurate. So I'll stop this and then we can go and I'll take any questions that you may have. Oops. Oh, yay, successfully did it. I'm back.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Barr. So we're going to go into, that was very exciting and infuriating too. I mean, as much as I've read this, I'm always.
It's so intentional. It's so intentional.
It's so infuriating.
Yeah.
I'm like, ah. But
Yeah.
so we're going to do what we normally do. If you have a question, you can use the little symbol to raise your hand. If you can't figure that out, if you just do this, I'll see you. So we'll take our questions one at a time here. So I see Donna McCula, you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. The more I read and the more I listen to presentations on the interpretations or the research that has been done about women in scripture, it seems to me that there's no response from greater, for lack of a better explanation, greater theological comment on the fact that this could be true from men. I'm wondering if you can just comment on that observation as legitimate, or
you mean that men do not comment on the fact that they could read the text differently, that women could be leaders in the.
That's right, and accept the research that women like yourself has done.
Yeah, well, I don't want to throw all men under the bus because I do think there actually are a lot. In fact, a medieval representation is Abelard. Abelard's a controversial figure. He is not, he's not an ideal, we shouldn't put him up as an image of how we should behave, I don't think. But at the same time, he does advocate for women's leadership. And we know a large part of this is because of Eloise. And because of his, and I don't know, I mean, I suspect it's because his relationship with her showed him that women really could lead, and that women's intellect and that women's calling was the same as men. And so he advocated not for her to have the same type of role as men, but for women to be recognized as leaders. So I do think there are men that have paused and have stopped and said, we do need to recognize the leadership of women in the church. However, I think what happened was after the Reformation era, and this is what I really talk about in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, is this idea of women's highest calling moves to their role as wives. And legally, women as wives were under male authority. And this is where we really begin to see this disappearance of loopholes for women to serve in leadership roles in the church, equal to or above men. We know in the medieval church that women were still, especially since the 12th century, that women were mostly not allowed to serve in sacramental roles. But at the same time, there is a loophole in the medieval church that allowed women to exercise authority, even exercise authority over major religious figures like bishops, archbishops, and even the Pope. So this loophole, I argue, really goes away in the early modern world. And that's what carries with us today, is this identification that women's highest calling is with their role as wives, which is also why the modern Protestant evangelical church has almost no place for single women. And this is a huge problem in evangelicalism, is that there's no role for single women. So does that help a little bit? I don't know. So I would say, and I think the men that have become most entrenched in not recognizing women's leadership or even being able to read the text a different way are the ones that are very much tied up in that power structure. Like if you think about, I've had a few of these godly men come after me lately, and they are mostly the leaders of the Gospel Coalition, of the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, 9 Marks, and so they are people, the SBC. They are people who have built their whole reputation, everything that they do, on this gender hierarchy. Instead of building their ministry on Jesus, they built it on a gender hierarchy. And so for them to change their mind on it would essentially pull the plug from everything they've done. And so I think they're terrified.
So what you're saying really is that it was a historical, sociological perspective on the role of women that changed this thinking.
That hardened.
Yes,
That's what I would argue. It hardened.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It reminds me of that line in your book, Dr. Barr. You say with the Reformation, we got rid of priests, but then we got husbands.
Yeah, we replaced the priest with the husband, and I got a lot of flack from, some people were like, no, surely this isn't true. And then they started going and looking, and you can actually see, like, people started sending me sermon transcripts from people like John MacArthur, who they actually say this in their sermons, that the husband is the priest of the home. And I mean, it's amazing from a Protestant perspective. It's like, I don't even understand how they reconcile that. It's really interesting to me.
It has its own, logic, right?
Yes,
So,
yeah.
Peggy, you have a question.
Thank you. First of all, I just want to say that a couple of my grad students and I are reading your book, and we're finding it really interesting. And I want to talk to you a little bit about your writing process, because one of the things that I find fascinating about your book, and for those of you who haven't read it, I think it's definitely worth reading. It's very accessible, but it's also, I think, very powerful and well documented. You interweave really important scholarship and also references, sort of summaries and generalizations about scholarship with your own personal experience.
Yeah.
And I want you to talk a little bit about how and why you decided to do that. I think it's very effective.
Yeah.
But it's unusual.
So I've had a lot of questions about that, and it was an intentional decision. One of my friends is Kristen Kobes-Dumay, and some of you may have read her book, Jesus and John Wayne. Yeah. And so Kristen, I still remember the conversation Kristen and I had when I told her I was going to do this. And so the reason that I decided to do it is, first of all, probably I'm not a huge C.S. Lewis fan. I'll just put that out there. There's some things I like about C.S. Lewis, but he's not my favorite, as Protestant evangelicals just always love C.S. Lewis. But I really like his autobiography on his salvation, which is Surprised by Joy. And it's a really powerful piece where he walks through his life and shows how all of the pieces of his life come together, where suddenly he believes. And it was always a really powerful testimony to me. The other thing is that evangelicals, our shared language is testimony. From my earliest upbringing, the things that we were taught to do was to share not only our belief in the good news, but how that belief changed us. That's really, that's a very important part of my Baptist upbringing, of evangelical upbringing, is not just the gospel, but how the gospel changed us. So I decided that I've read all of these books on women in the church, all of this scholarship, like I just shared with y'all Warren Carter's article. That's from 1996. And yet most modern evangelicals have never heard of that article. They haven't read it, especially because it's in a Catholic text, a scholarly academic text, journal. And it's not anything at all that's on their radar. So all of the scholarship is out there to make it clear that there is no reason to keep women from being leaders in the church, preachers and teachers, even ordained. But people aren't reading it. And so what I wanted with my book was I needed to get people to read that scholarship. That's really what I'm trying to do with my book. And so I decided to use the evangelical language, which is testimony. And, as a scholar, it was a hard decision because, especially being a female scholar, we are judged more harshly by our stories. And I knew it wouldn't be fun for me to actually share that story, but I also thought that it would get people to listen to me. So as I tell people, the evidence is not built on my story. The evidence is built on the historical, the scholarship. But my story is an entry point to get people to the scholarship, as well as to show them the real life impact. I also think somewhat I was inspired by Christine de Pizan, and I use her a lot in there. And I've written on her before, even before the Making of Biblical Womanhood. But I'm always struck by, there's these arguments about whether or not she was really a feminist. And of course, the idea is that to be a feminist, you have to have sort of a political consciousness, that you have to be aware of trying to change things for other women. And so people have argued that Christine probably, they wouldn't characterize her as a feminist in that sense. But I always get stuck on the fact that she does have an understanding. I mean, this is why she fights against that misogynist text, The Romance of the Rose, because she sees that it hurts women. And so she wants to help women. And so she wants to change ideas about women so women are treated better. So that was did that help somewhat? I gave you several answers there.
It did help. And I mean, I think the construction of the storyline, of your storyline, is really very well placed, so that you put I'm not going to go into it for people who haven't read the book yet, but the thing that comes at the end.
Yeah.
When you talk about the second shocking experience in your life.
Yeah.
I think it's very well placed.
The reason it's at the end is because I didn't decide to do it until I got to the end.
I can imagine.
And so it was, and at that point, so it wasn't really that I was like saving it up until the end. It's just I hadn't made that decision until I was writing the last 2 chapters.
I simply ask you to check out the one of the most recent blog entries at the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion blog from Judith Plasko, who I think will appreciate what she just wrote there.
I will. I'll go check that out. Thank you.
Thanks,
you. Peggy. Good questions, Peggy. Thanks a lot. Joan Drennan, you have a question.
Yes, I'm wondering about what year or what time was Martha? Did she live?
Martha, Bethany, 1st century with Jesus. She was one of Jesus's, clearly was in during that ministry. Yeah, one of Jesus's contemporaries. So he goes to her house. So she's 1st century Jewish woman. One of the other sort of myths that Protestant evangelicals have is that Christianity was liberated Jewish women, and what they don't realize is that there was already liberating, that God had been liberating women throughout Judaism. And so we actually already have a very powerful, narrative of these leading Jewish women who even taught in synagogues, et cetera. And so there is that tradition there. And so Martha actually makes a lot of sense within that Jewish world that did allow women's leadership. So I think that's something too with Protestantism. Protestants have a lot of anti-Catholicism in them, which has them reject a lot of these powerful stories of female saints. And they also have I think there's still anti-Semitism, and there's a lot of a racist strain within white evangelicalism, and it has them not, and that is part of why they reject Jewish women's leadership.
Okay,
So
thank you.
that wasn't your question, but there you are.
Thanks, Joan. Barbara, you have a question. You have to unmute, Barbara. Oops, did she leave us?
This is my first time attending one of these, so
great.
very
fun.
good. I've just looked in my Catholic Bibles. Both of them have it as Junia, prominent among the apostles, and it even says that in many ancient versions that the name is written Julia. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But my question is, lately, I've been
I'm glad you were looking it up in your Bible. So
yeah, it was the New American Bible and the Revised Standard Version that came from the Vatican. But anyway, they're both say Junia, which is kind of cool. In many years of pondering about women's role in the church, I've come to the conclusion, and I can't find any scholarship on it, so maybe you've seen it. You know, there are evidences of tombstones with women's names, and it says priest on it. And what I'm wondering if in Acts and some of the letters that these women leaders who are named actually might have come converted from pagan churches where they were the priests in a pagan church. And so in order to grow the faith, they needed these other religions to come into it. So you couldn't exactly get rid of them, the women leaders, because they were priests already. So they just let them come in and grow the faith, and then they just sort of died out. They never replaced them as we went along and got more and more patriarchal.
So
is that a far-flung theory, or
you know,
I mean, I see that all, you know, in my head all the time as a possible explanation.
You are correct. One of the things, again, this sort of myth that we've created about women in the first century is that women didn't serve in any of these types of leadership roles in either the Greco-Roman world or in the Judaic world. And that's not true. I have one of my colleagues here at Baylor actually has written a book called A Place at the Altar. And it's about women as priests in the Roman world, and that women did serve in these functions. Now, what's interesting is they mostly served in these functions as priests alongside their husbands. So there is that in there, but they did serve independent roles. So it's kind of interesting, but there is that. And we do have evidence of these women serving. We also, Kevin Madigan and Carolyn Osek's book on ordained women, where they actually walk through pretty much all the evidence that they can find in the early church and of women in these types of ordained roles. And so they even talk about the evidence from carvings, et cetera. And so some of that. So I would encourage you can see in both of those books, I think you would find really interesting. And also the problem you're talking about is exactly what we see with Ephesus, and in which Paul writes to these, and what we think these women that he tells to not teach. He's not giving a directive for women not to teach at all. He is talking to a specific group of women who did hold leadership roles in their religious community. And now we're simply walking in as these converts who didn't know enough yet about the Christian tradition. And we're walking in and trying to teach. And he says, no, you've got to learn first before you can teach. And this is something too, we also see this in Corinth, where we see him give the same directive to men, where they are bringing in these traditions from the Corinthian world. And Paul says, no, that's not what we do as Christians. And so we see Paul, we see people bringing in their, this is what we all do. We carry things. That's what I said, exactly what I said about Martha. We carry our world to the gospel. And we have to learn to separate that. So yes, I think there is definitely a lot of truth in what you said, that you can find both in the Bible as well as in extra historical sources. And we do know that the tradition of women leading, we know women were leaders in the early church. In the 5th and the 6th century, we start seeing conciliar decrees saying women can't be ordained, can't serve. And that tells us that women were serving in these types of roles.
Great. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you.
Rita, go ahead. And
Thanks so much.
And just to say that Libby Schrader is joined us tonight, and it would be great to have her do some dialogue with you about Martha a little bit. But anyway. So
Oh
go ahead, Rita.
yeah, is she?
Go ahead.
I was
She's-
going to mention.
Yeah.
Mention her
Mhm,
research.
yeah.
I was wondering if y'all have been following it.
Yeah,
about how
yeah.
she thinks that
Yeah.
Martha
So we'd love to
might
hear
actually
from,
be Mary.
yeah, we'd love to hear from you, Libby.
It's
So if you
fascinating.
want to,
Yeah, I mean,
anyway,
I
go
think
ahead.
this-
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
Rita. And I'm texting with Rita on the side, by the way.
I was
Um,
just, are you going to ask her about Mary and Martha and
Yeah.
Martha
Well,
in
I think
11? So
we've
Hi, Libby. It's
Um,
nice to meet you.
Hi, I know Beth and I have messaged
We-
so much on Twitter,
we
but
have, yeah. It's nice.
we
to
haven't
meet
actually
you.
really talked face to face. And thank you so much, Deb, for letting me say hi. So I think it's tricky when we say Martha of Bethany, because for our whole lives, we've been taught that Mary and Martha are from Bethany and that they were Lazarus's two sisters. It's just a little tricky because I'm suggesting that Martha and Mary in Luke's gospel are a different family than
Mhm.
Lazarus and Mary in John's gospel. And if that is confusing to you, I recommend that you watch the FutureChurch presentation that I did in August, which explains. So
I probably
mean,
should have watched that before I did
oh
this.
no, it's okay. I mean, I do think that Lazarus and Mary are from Bethany, but Martha and Mary, if you look at Luke 10, it seems as though they're in Galilee or Samaria, according to
Yeah.
that narrative. But everything else that Professor Barr has said is absolutely, I mean, she's spot on. I love the Martha. Is it the Tarrasque? Is that what it's called? The weird dragon thing that she
Oh
attacked?
yeah. I was like, what were you talking? Yeah. Oh no, I love
That stuff
the
is
dragon.
so fun.
And that's the thing too about your research here. Regardless of who Martha is, regardless of who the woman is referenced in Luke 10, the word that is used to reference her is not a domestic hostess. I mean, that's the thing.
I completely agree.
So,
And I have no issue with the text in Luke 10. I think Martha was an actual person that Luke is talking about, Martha and Mary. I have no objection to the text of Luke 10.
It's also with John where it's, I have a seat, it makes a lot more sense that Mary Magdalene actually recognizes Jesus as, which is one of your, but anyway, that's a whole.
Right.
Other.
Tertullian says that Mary gave the confession, but I think the confession is so central in John's gospel. We think Martha says it, but Tertullian said that Mary said it. I'll get out of the way. Thank you, Russ, for sharing the link. But it's so nice to hear more from Professor Barr. It's so nice to finally see it.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you. I had no idea you would be here. I was thinking about you while I was doing my talk. I was like, I really should ask them if they have read. Anyway, so I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Libby. We're so happy about all these new discoveries and things that are happening for you. But anyway, Rita, go ahead. What were you going to ask?
So I have, first place, thank you very much. I'm just loving your book. I haven't finished it yet.
Thank you for that lovely introduction you gave me. That was so kind.
Oh, my pleasure. I am a devoted Mary Magdalene advocate. My dream is to have a statue of her proclaiming the resurrection in Pope Francis's office that he looks at every single day. Within the next 2 years, accepting suggestions on how to accomplish that.
I think that's a very good
putting it out
plan.
there. So there are 2 points. One, I just want to point out in the New American Bible, the Catholic version, they do get a little punch in on Junia by saying,
what do they say?
Yeah, they still do. They say most editors translate this as Junius, but
It's like the ESV, and it's just, there is no reason to say that.
There's also a really, really interesting book. It's called The Word According to Eve. It came out in 1998.
Yep.
And it still fabulous, a great survey, and it's a tribute to the women who have forged,
Right.
who led the way for you and Libby, and for
Mhm.
Dr. Christine Axon, who's also on tonight. So I just wanted to point that out. And he has a great little thing on Junia, because Martin Luther also
Yeah.
proposed Junius.
Yes,
So-
he's the only but the funny thing is that everybody kind of ignored him on that. Nobody really followed
Yeah.
him. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
Luther's another whole story.
So there's another whole thing that could be really fascinating between you and some Catholic biblical scholars, to compare, so at the Reformation, and then for the Catholics, the post-Reformation and
Yeah.
Trent, which is so decisive. And it's terrible for Mary Magdalene. This is the first time that the cardinals designate one official list of saints that
Mhm.
is mandated across the regions. Well, of course, the regions, some of them maintain their own, but mandate. And on that list, for the first time in 1570, Mary Magdalene was stripped of all titles and
Yep.
only given the title penitent.
Yep.
No longer apostle of the apostles or equal to none of that. And then on top of that, because Calvin was so, they were laughing because they were biblical scholars, Calvin and other Protestants. And they had determined back in the 16th century, but now early in the 16th, now later in the 16th century, that there was the three-person conflation of Gregory I in 591,
Mhm.
which I highly recommend you reading, the Mary Magdalene cover-up by Esther de Boer, her analysis of that homily. Anyhow, so the Catholic cardinals dug in even deeper, and it became a Protestant lie that Mary Magdalene wasn't a prostitute. And so there's a double push for, that we still have to, and you still
Right.
will encounter some people say, oh, you're talking about the Protestant Mary Magdalene,
Mhm.
not about the real, so that's an interesting element there. But I was very curious to see that despite the Protestant biblical scholars in the 16th century being so clear that she was not a prostitute or a penitent, that the evangelical church, was able to get rid of her anyhow, by making her an anomaly. Well, no, she's not a good example for everyone. No, she's just really unique. I loved the way you highlight. So I just wanted to point that out, and thank you.
Yeah.
And the challenge goes on.
Yeah, no, I mean, and that's always there's a continuity in how we write women out. And one of the ways that we do it is we point out, sometimes we bring forward, these women who served in a particular role, and we Deborah-ize them. And I use the word Deborah because that's what evangelicals do, is they say Deborah is anomalous. These judges, that the reason, the story I grew up with Deborah is that she was given that position because men didn't step up to the job. And so it's not that women should lead, it's that women have to lead when men don't act like men. And that's what we tend to do to female leaders, is we make them these anomalies, not people called by God to serve in these ways.
And the last thing, just very quick, if you could give Russ or Deb the reference to that medieval illumination you had, because Dr.
Oh, sure.
Christine-
Okay. So there's a recent article that's on Phoebe as a deacon. I've been doing some research on medieval references to these women, and it's in the Medieval Religious Culture, the Journal of Medieval Religious Culture. It's an article by Anne Clark, and it's the 2019. I think it's the very first volume of 2019, the Journal of Medieval Religious Culture. And so she and it's interesting because she tries to figure out where it came from, and it's really fascinating, but that's where it is.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Rita. So Maureen Mulcrone, you have a question.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Dr. Barr, for continuing the Epiphany. I wasn't aware of your book, and I consider this a belated Christmas gift.
Good, I'm glad.
My comment is not a question so much as a recollection. When I was studying theology in the last century, back in the 1970s, I remember an article on this text that appeared in a journal, maybe Feminist Biblical Scholarship or something. And it reminded me of Elizabeth Schisler-Fiorenza's comment on it about a hermeneutic of suspicion, especially when you see women pitted against one another.
Right.
Thank you again.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen.
I love the comments. I see people looking up Junia in their Bibles.
Yeah.
It's just, I love, anytime I can get people to actually start looking at their text and comparing it with other translations, I think that's fabulous.
Great. So time is running out, but we've got Pat and MJ and Amanda. Those are the last three. And so please keep your questions kind of short if you can. So Pat, go ahead.
This isn't so much a question for you, although I sincerely enjoyed this, and I've written some notes about things I will look up. I read a book not too long ago by Sister Christine Schenck, and I just looked to see if one of the behind me, but the early sarcophagus used to contain images of women. And so when she did research on the sarcophagi from the 1st and 2nd and 3rd century, she found women who had their hands in the orans position, and those people were preaching or praying. She had some that had scrolls, and the scrolls were at the feet of those women. So she knew that those people had been reading and, preaching hopefully, the gospel. So there might be something that other people would be interested in seeing about her, reading her book, to see some of the real old references that she has done her research on and presented in that book. I'm sorry, I just don't remember the name.
Christina.
It's Christina Schenck's.
Christine Schenck,
I have it on my Kindle. I can see the picture on the front of the book, but I can't remember. It's Crispina and her sisters. Yeah, that's what it is. Crispina and her sisters. I mean, this is one of the points that I keep trying to make, is that so much scholarship is out there that shows the evidence for women serving in these roles, and the biblical evidence that women are called by God. And so, I mean, there's really no excuse. There's no excuse.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. MJ, you have a question or a comment?
Hi, thank you so much. First of all, let me just say thank you, because I got onto this not realizing that there was going to be fodder for a book I'm writing that is personal growth and spiritual growth for women from a Christ perspective. For women, sex, love, and heartbreak. So this is really exciting. But the question actually that I have is because I am a progressive, Christian on the mystic path, contemplative path, but I hang out with a lot of evangelical conservative types. So I'm wondering, how can I bring this up without, I'm a kind of a forward talking kind of person, but I want to be able to talk about this with people and not just leave it for a book that I'm writing. But have you had success with talking in fellowship groups or just one-on-one with other evangelicals about this topic of women being erased and their roles? Because I have definitely experienced 100% what you said about single women not having a role. Single women don't have a role in the society that I live in right now. It's in Hawaii.
Right.
Evangelical church, we are forgotten. We are not invited to things. We are not included. I didn't understand why, and you pointed it out, and now I can share it with friends. So thank you.
It's exactly right. So I wrote my book for evangelical women. I mean, so that's actually, so I will say that it, and they're reading it. So I think that is good. Not all of them like it, but they are reading it. But I would say, most evangelical women, it's, a lot of, this is still my world. And one of the things women recognize is they recognize that women aren't on the stage. They recognize that women aren't called to pray. They recognize that sometimes women aren't even in the worship on stage. And so that's actually a really easy way, talking about have you ever seen a woman actually get up on your stage? What do you think about that? Have you ever seen a woman teach in a class? What do you think about that? And sometimes because, the experience of so many women is that they haven't. Or if they have, they've seen it in very contained, very, certain circumstances. And whenever they see, the joke is that when a woman stands behind a pulpit in an evangelical church, she's giving her testimony. And whereas the men preach, the women give their testimonies. And that's another. So I think talking with them about their experiences in church, and even as you pointed out with single women, even starting a conversation like, why aren't single women included in what's going on in your church? Or do you feel excluded as a single woman from your church? Sometimes that just opens up, if you start with their experiences and then can maybe invite them to look more specifically at what's going on with the Bible. And with the Bible, my advice is always to start people with Romans 16. Just get them there and just read it through and have them write down every woman in it. And that just often breaks the ice, because you cannot read Romans 16 and see all those women in leadership and not have questions if you have been taught that women can't lead. So I find it a really powerful teaching tool to use Romans 16. Is that a little bit helpful? Maybe?
Yeah, 100%. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thanks,
Dr.
MJ.
Barr.
Thanks for your question. So the last question is from Amanda Dillon.
Hi, Dr. Barr. I was very interested in something you said at the beginning there about and it picks up a little bit on the last speaker about single women in the Protestant churches, just because in the Catholic Church, single women have been able to find a role in religious life.
Right.
So that sounds, I wasn't aware of that. And I'd really like to hear something more about that quickly, if you can. Thank you.
Yeah. No, and thank you for staying up till 1 p.m. to listen
Well,
to me. I can't believe that. 1 a.m. So this is a very common reality in modern evangelicalism. You will see many conversations about this. And really what it has to do with is that evangelicalism teaches that God called people to be married. Marriage is really enshrined in many ways within there is a long history to this. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this history in my next book. There's a long history to how we got here. But there is an idea that if you are a godly woman, you are a married woman. And that also, firmly puts you under your husband's leadership. It also puts you in the role of bearing children, which is also in the modern evangelical church, women who are married, but either choose not to have children or can't have children. They are also feel this same type of, being ostracized like single women, because they feel that there is something wrong with them, because godly women are married and bear children in the evangelical world. And there's really no room for women to deviate from that. If you're new to this conversation, I hardly ever recommend anybody to read Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, which is written by John Piper and Wayne Grudem, but they wrote a new introduction to it in 2016, I think, that was directed towards single women, where they try to talk, and it's this really sad sort of thing, because it pretty much puts single women in this waiting period, that you may not be married yet, but if you are faithful, you can still act like a housewife even without having a family. It's really, you can have other people in your house that you can act as their mother. It's like the only role for women is to act in this surrogate wife mother role, and they cannot conceptualize women outside of that role. So it's this is a problem that has hurt so many women in the evangelical church.
I can imagine. It's really interesting. I'm really interested to hear about that. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you all. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Dr. Barr. This has just been fabulous. You are
thank you.
So engaging. The information you've given us is so exciting, so infuriating all at the same time. It's just wonderful. So I want to just end with a few announcements and a prayer, and again, a big thank you to all of you who asked your wonderful questions, your comments, and to you, Dr. Barr. Oh, I just wish you the best of luck in all that you do as you move forward. It's just wonderful. Just to say a few things, on Sunday this week, FutureChurch has our next Women Witnesses for Racial Justice prayer service. It is called, we have entitled it Say Her Name, which is to remember Black women who have been murdered, killed by police. And we have Dr. Melinda Pellerin preaching, Kale August, Alessandra Harris. So we'll have a really good group of participants for the liturgy. We'll hope you join us. It'll be at 7 o'clock on Sunday. In February, on all the Wednesdays in February, we have a 4-part series by Sister Maureen Sullivan called Fertile Ground, Vatican II, the Synod, and the Future of the Catholic Church. And she's going to take us through the foundations of Vatican II to help us see where we are today in this important synodal process going forward. On February 15th, we have Dr. Diane Batts-Morrow, who's going to do another Women Witnesses for Racial Justice presentation for us for Black History Month, and it's called Making a Way Out of No Way, where she talks about the Black Catholic sisters who found a way to teach children of color in a Jim Crow world. On February 12th, I also want to tell you that Call to Action Maryland is going to have Shannon D. Williams talking. It's going to be an all-day conference. So I have a link, and I did put it in the box at one point, and maybe Russ can put it back in there for us right now, but I will make sure that I send it to all of you when you get the copy of this presentation, the video. We'll give you all the links to all these things coming up so that you don't miss anything. So tonight, I just want to end with a simple prayer of thanks. Dear God, tonight we give thanks for the women of the Hebrew Scriptures and the women of the Christian Scriptures, for the mystics and saints, for the leaders and theologians like Dr. Barr, for workers and ministers, for mothers and daughters, for all the holy women and men who have gone before us, for the holy women gathered here, for the holy men gathered here, for mothers, sisters, daughters, aunts, granddaughters, for the women we call our dearest friends and those who have taught us and called us to strength and faith, and for all the men who have been allies in our struggle to recover our authentic Christian history and take up the work that God has for us today. Christ, we thank you for blessing us, strengthening us, and building up this community of believers. May we be a blessing to one another, to you. May we serve you and each other and all the people you love. And the people said, Amen.